Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our new webinar series today. I am with my colleague Alexandre Parente. Good morning, Alexandre.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
So thanks again for joining. Today we're going to talk about the automotive CO2 emissions situation in 2021 in Europe. Jato has usually released this information every year during Geneva Motor Show. And this year we decided to do this in two ways. Today through this webinar, and from tomorrow we will distribute our report with the more detailed information. So let's start. So I am Felipe Munoz. I am the industry expert at Jato. I am also the PR manager, and I deal with all media inquiries and analysis with media and production of content for our platforms. And Alex is our senior consultant. As I said, I'm the head of market analysis. I was the market head of analysis in the biotech industry. I also work at Fiat Chrysler Automobiles in the digital marketing area and in Alfa Romeo. And I am an active collaborator for some media around Europe. I also run my own social media channels with a lot of followers and a lot of traction. And I currently deal with PR activities and media inquiries involving tier one media such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and so on. I'm joined also then by Alexandre. Alexandre?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, Felipe, to be a guest today for this webinar. I'm Alexandre Parente, senior consultant at Jato for about 10 years now. I have some experience before that outside of the automotive sector, but my main experience and career is within the automotive industry. I am lucky enough to have virtual discussions and live discussions with virtually every single player in the industry. So I'm in contact with OEMs, NSCs, but also component suppliers, leasing companies, and discussing also with banks and captives all around the world, with a special focus on Europe. I don't have as many followers as you, Felipe, on social media, but I have let's say this market analysis experience and this expertise with working with all these industry players. So I'm really happy to be here today to share all the insights we have with you, and I hope this will be interesting for all the audience around the world.
Thank you, Alexandre. I'm sure we will have a very interesting session today. So today we will show you the trends and the current situation regarding CO2 emissions, what has happened over the last years, and what happened in 2021, which was a challenging year, but also a very good one in terms of emissions. Then we will share with you some details of these average emissions by country, by fuel type, segment, and OEM. And finally, we will talk about the strong correlation, positive correlation between the development and the introduction of EVs and the reduction on emissions. So let's start. Some considerations first. The information you're going to see in this webinar, it corresponds to 17 countries in Europe. These are all of them, where we get enough information under WLTP method, WLTP standards, to make conclusions. The countries that you do not see here is because there wasn't enough. The methodology is as usual. All the emission data is taken directly from public sources, and when this is not the case, we take it from comparable vehicles. The information includes the registrations, weighted WLTP emissions without super credits. It's also important to mention that we are only showing the results. We are not comparing any of these results to each OEM's targets. So you will see in the coming slides how was the situation. So as you can see here, there is a very positive trend, especially since 2020, in terms of average CO2 emissions for the passenger cars registered in Europe, 17 in those 17 countries I already mentioned. So the situation, the average fell from almost 121 grams per kilometer in 2019 to only 91.91 under NEDC. However, as many of you must know, the European Commission changed the regulation and the way the industry measures the CO2 emissions, and now the industry uses WLTP. So as we have this information only since 2020, and you can see that there is also a big drop between these 2 years, which is very related, strongly related to the EV market share. As you can see here, the EVs, meaning electrified vehicles, which include not only the pure electric cars and plug-in hybrids, but also the mild hybrids and the pure hybrids, have jumped from 3% in 2015 and 16 up to 42% last year. So these cars, which are usually posting lower emissions than the traditional gasoline or diesel cars, are already made up almost half of the market in these countries, so of sales in these countries, which is definitely one of the reasons why we see this reduction. Not the only one, of course. We also have to bear in mind that there were fewer cars last year. There was a problem from the point of view of demand. People were locked down, and also a problem from the point of view of supply, because there were not enough semiconductors to build cars, and the focus was on several specific segments, as we will see later.
Yeah, Felipe, it's totally right. And here on this graph, you can clearly see that before the pandemic, we were facing an increase of average CO2 emissions every year from 2017. So the trend was not looking good, and it's really from 2020 that we've seen a shift with a significant reduction. As you said, Felipe, most of it is due to the electrification, but we have to highlight also the efforts made by manufacturers and component suppliers to improve combustion engines and to implement new technologies. We can think about the downsizing of engines in combination with turbo technology. There are also various cylinder management systems to deactivate some cylinders when they are not needed, or simply stop and start systems that are widely adopted today. All of these technologies contributing to get a better fuel economy on one side, but also to reduce emissions. And this is also contributing to what we see in 2020 and 2021.
Yes, you're right, Alex. Thank you. There is improvement not only in terms of more EVs available in the market, but also when we talk about the gasoline and diesel cars available in the market. We will see later that even these cars are improving their average emissions. So this is also helping the industry. So just to understand the differences between NEDC and WLTP, their impact on emissions, we can see here that, yes, there is, under WLTP, we see a higher average, but still in both cases, there was a reduction between 13% in the case of NEDC up to 16% under WLTP. So in any case, however, whenever we measure the CO2 emissions, there are reductions, which is significant reductions. I mean, The 16% reduction under WLTP was not a case over the last 5 years. And this is, as we said, a consequence of less polluting cars in the market. Just as a matter of example, I took 4 markets where we had enough information both under an EDC and WLTP, and you can see the gap between their emissions between 3% in the case of Germany. Under WLTP, emissions are 3% higher in Germany, up to 16% in the case of Italy. In the whole region, we are talking of a difference of 9% between both ways of measuring the CO2.
Yeah, if I may add to this, to understand the gap between NEDC and WLTP for our audience, WLTP stands for Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicle Test Procedure, and it simulates, let's say, the real-life driving conditions more accurately than NEDC. This test procedure includes more dynamic phases when compared to NEDC. That was the previous homologation procedure. And we have, for instance, the acceleration rates that are better to reflect the real world driving conditions. So this is now, WLTP is now in place in Europe, and we end up with higher CO2 levels and fuel consumption on the same vehicle compared to the previous driving cycles known as NEDC. NEDC has been heavily criticized in the past because we were ending up with figures that were unachievable in reality. So WLTP is closer to reality. It's still not reality, but it's much closer, and that explains also this gap you see. But still, regardless of NEDC and WLTP, we clearly see a very significant reduction, CO2 reduction over this past couple of years.
Yeah, progress. Then what happened to the emissions by country? So as expected, Norway is by far the country with the lowest emissions. The regulation, the culture, and many other factors benefit the demand of low emission cars, up to the point that last year their average emissions of the cars registered last year was 16.9 grams per kilometer, which is very low. We have to bear in mind that 93% of the cars registered in Norway, new cars registered in Norway last year, were electrified. 64% were pure electric, and 21% were plug-in. So most of the cars there are using an electric engine to be powered, and it's the consequence of very good regulation, but also it's a consequence of making the gasoline and diesel cars even more expensive, at the point that today in Norway it's cheaper an EV than an internal combustion engine car. So Norway was followed by some of its peers in Scandinavia, like Sweden, where also 68% of the new car registrations were electrified, and Finland, also with a 76.1 grams per kilometer. In the others, in the opposite side, there is Croatia and Slovenia. Slovenia, for example, only 11% of its car registrations were electrified, which with pure electric cars counting for only 3%, and plug-ins only for 0.4%. So, but the reasons here are mostly related also to the infrastructure. These countries are not as prepared as in the north in terms of infrastructure, and the purchase power of the population is not as high as in the north. We have to remember that usually, with the exception of Norway, the electrified vehicles are more expensive than gasoline or diesel ones. So you can see the differences between some regions in Europe. For example, while in the Scandinavian countries, the average was 58.3% grams per kilometer, in the southern part of Europe was definitely higher. So the gap, there is still a gap, but the southern countries should catch up in the coming years as more infrastructure arrives, and especially as more affordable EVs are launched are introduced. So the performance compared to 2020 puts Norway again in the first place. Its reductions fell by 49%. Once again, it's explained by this EV boom, or mostly by the fact that people cannot simply buy internal combustion engines because they are definitely more expensive, and because when you buy an EV, you have a lot of infrastructure where to charge it and a lot of benefits. Also, its Scandinavian peers posted the biggest reduction, while in the south the progress was more moderate, with Slovenia with only 5% reduction and Croatia with 8%. Spain, for example, was also lagging behind, along with Italy. They still need more. They still need more infrastructure. They need more active role of their local car makers, especially in the case of Italy. But in any case, you can see that there is a progress everywhere in Europe, from 32% in Scandinavia up to 9% reduction in Southern Europe. What happened to the fuel type? So here it's also very interesting to see that most of the market continues to be gasoline or diesel. I mean, these two cars, which include their mild hybrid versions, made up 77% of the car registrations in Europe. And these two fuel types are producing the highest emissions, with gasoline with 134.2 grams and diesel almost 130 grams. However, there was progress also for these cars, as Alex said before. The reduction on the emissions is not only due to more EVs on the roads, but also because the gasoline and the diesel cars that you find are cleaner today. There have been also some investments and some progress development of more efficient engines, which allow, for example, gasoline cars to reduce their emissions compared to 2020 by 3%, while diesel reduced their emission by 5%, which is significant considering their big weight on total registrations. However, they are very far away from plug-in hybrids, for example, plug-in hybrids where their average was only 37 grams per kilometer, and which made up 9.4% of the market. So let's continue. Then the results by segment. It's also very interesting to see the big gap in terms of emissions between what the consumer prefer. So in Europe, most of the registrations are still small compact cars. They include the A, B, and C segments. They made up 41% of the registrations last year, and their average was 93.3 grams, which is definitely lower than the average posted by their SUV counterparts, which are still very popular, were still gaining a lot of traction, but their emissions are still very high compared to the traditional cars. It's interesting to see, however, that the biggest cars, the ones that are usually heavier and more expensive, are posting the lowest emissions. This is where most of the electrification is taking place, in the mid-size and large cars and SUVs. They include, for example, cars like the Tesla Model 3, Tesla Model Y, and Volkswagen ID.4, and many others that are becoming very popular in many countries in Europe. However, these segments made up only 16% of the total market. Even if the SUVs are still producing higher emissions than their counterparts in the car segment, we must say that they were able to reduce their emissions by 18% between 2020 and 2021, mostly because of the introduction of more low emission SUVs. This was one of the limitations for the growth on EVs, because until 2020, most of what people found on the dealers when they wanted to get an EV was a regular car, a regular sedan, or a regular hatchback. It's the case of the Renault Zoe or the Tesla Model 3. However, as most of the people, globally speaking, not only in Europe, are looking for SUVs, so that was supposed to be the next step in the electrification race, to bring more electric SUVs, or at least plug-in hybrid SUVs. That's the case, and that's why we see this reduction of 18% in SUVs, with, for example, with the mid-size SUVs segment falling by 53% in terms of emissions, mostly thanks to the cars like the Volkswagen ID.4, but also the Hyundai Ioniq 5, the Ford Mustang Mach-E, and many others. In any case, also in the car segment, I mean the A segment, B segment, C segment, and D segment, the reductions were significant too. Segments like the city cars were able to reduce their emissions by 26%. And this is also related to the fact that there are more electrified versions, but also the gasoline versions of these cars are more efficient than ever. Then we have the results, the gap between SUVs and cars in terms of emissions. So we usually hear that SUVs, yes, are more pollutant, and they are bigger, of course, and heavier. But how big is the difference? The difference is higher in the extremes. So the small SUVs are producing 19% more emissions than their equivalents in the car segment. So let's say a B SUV is producing 19% more emissions than a B hatchback, for example. In the other side of the table, we see the luxury segment, with also here SUVs producing much more emissions. We still need to see these electrified big SUVs that should come in the coming months. Last week we saw, for example, the new Lotus Eletre, which is going to play, let's say, which is also bringing more electrified versions, even in the luxury segment. But if we see a difference in the mid-size segment here, when there are now more electrified SUVs, mid-size SUVs, than electrified mid-size cars, up to the point that their emissions were 14% lower than the sedans or wagons in this segment.
In proportion of the price, I mean, adding batteries, even a small mild hybrid system or additional batteries to have a plug-in hybrid represent just a fraction of the price of this SUV. So an extra few thousand euros or pounds on an SUV will not be perceived as the same effort to be asked to customers than on a small car or on a compact car. So the proportionality of the extra amount of money buyers would have to pay has different importance when you consider the segment. So that's why SUVs now are heavily electrified. It is an extra cost, but if you consider the total price of the car, this extra effort is not negligible, but it's much less important than on smaller segments. That's really important to understand this picture, Felipe.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's true. And actually, when you look at this, you find out the reasons why now the SUVs continue to gain traction. If they gain traction even before the electrification boom, now they have even more reasons to keep growing and become the top selling segment in Europe. What happened to the OEMs? So between 2020 and 2021, all of the OEMs except for one, but most of them posted progress, posted reductions in their average emissions. Tesla, of course, continues to be on the top spot. It's only producing pure electric cars, but it was followed by the Chinese brands, and by Chinese brands I mean all of those Chinese car makers that have presence in Europe or in some countries in Europe, which are mostly selling electric cars or plug-in hybrid cars. Still, they do not have a big part of the market, but it's significant to see them above the rest of local and Western OEMs. Hyundai and Kia was the third best performer in terms of emissions. However, the Geely group, composed mostly by Volvo and Polestar, was the OEM with the highest reduction of 23% between the 2 years. We see the two leaders in Europe, Volkswagen Group and Stellantis, very close, both of them with very similar progress. And other makers, such as the Japanese ones, which have been focused more on hybrids, posting also progress, but in a more moderate rate. The dependence on hybrids has helped a lot over the last year, up to the point where we could see makers like Toyota or Suzuki up in the ranking in terms of emissions. But today the hybrids are just one part of the solution, and we see other makers such as the Koreans, such as the Germans, focusing on even going further in terms of development of these engines and focusing on pure electric or plug-in.
Yeah, that's right, Felipe. And if we look back at the past decade, Toyota was always a top player in this field. So posting record low CO2 levels compared with their main competitors. And it's true that Toyota bet it all on hybrids since the Prius back in 1997, I think. So it was more or less 25 years ago. And we can say it has been a huge success for the company, with probably more than 15 million hybrids vehicles sold worldwide. And as I said, they have registered very low CO2 levels for their fleet over the past decade. But now the competition has finally catch up. They have various hybrid technologies, and they have a fully electric vehicles offer. Toyota is not the best player anymore on this field. And in 2021, as we see here, they are posting the worst year-over-year progress in terms of CO2 reduction. We are seeing fantastic CO2 reductions from -10 to -20% from all the players. Toyota is only at -4. To offset that, Toyota already announced a new electric car that is due next year, the bZ4X. And Lexus, that is the premium brand of the group, they have already started to sell EVs. So if you look at Lexus, you can already purchase an EV1. So Toyota Group understood that they also need to change and to find alternatives to their hybrid solutions. That's really a key message here from this analysis.
It's important to add to your point, Alex, that today hybrids continue to be more affordable than pure electric cars. So the companies focusing on electric cars must work also on reducing the price, because we are leaving a big part of the consumers out with the current prices, while the hybrids, which is another solution, are not that expensive, not only for the final consumer, but also are not expensive to produce as the electric ones. So it could be the best alternative for those consumers that do not have enough money to buy the pure electric cars. So finally, what's the correlation between EVs and emissions? It's important to understand the impact of EVs on the emissions. We are finally seeing a positive impact because EVs are not a niche segment anymore. It's not the rare car you see in the street anymore. Actually, it's the roads in Europe are now, it's very easy to see an electric car in the roads of Europe, which was not the case 2 years ago. But today they are having an impact on emissions, and this is the case. I took the 3 best performers in terms of CO2 reduction by country segment and OEM, and how the EV share increased between those 2 years in percentage points. So, for example, Norway, which was the country that reduced the most its emissions by 49%, was able to increase by 13 points the share of pure electric cars and plug-in hybrid cars, up to the point that it was the 3rd best highest increase among Europe. Finland, for example, was able to reduce 32% emissions, and it was the 2nd highest increase in terms of EV share among Europe. When we go with the situation by segment, the 3 best performers were the mid-size SUVs, the city cars, and the mid-size cars. And the SUVs, or the mid-size SUVs, were able to reduce the emissions by 53%, and they were the first segment, or the highest, they posted the highest EV market share increase among all segments. So there is, I mean, this segment got a lot of new EV models during the year, and it had an impact. Of course, they have an impact, and people are buying these cars. We have to consider that this segment, the DSUV segment, it's probably the most popular one for EVs because it's the most global segment. These cars are not only popular in Europe, but also in North America and China. So it's easier for the OEMs to electrify them because they will find more consumers not all over the world. The same happened to the city cars, for example. It was the 2nd best performer in terms of CO2 reduction, but also the 2nd one in terms of EV share. And finally, in the case of OEMs, in Geely Group, which was the best performer, was also the OEM to increase the most the share of its EVs in its sales by almost 15 points between these 2 years. It was followed by Daimler and BMW. So there is a big correlation between the development and the introduction of low emission cars and their impact on the CO2, not in all ways, in the country level, segment level, and OEM level. So just a final note, the WLTP values presented in this here today correspond to the following percentage of model versions published. So we got the information from all these countries, and for example, 95% of the models version published the WLTP data in Austria, for example, to an average of 88% for all these 17 nations in Europe. Tomorrow, all of you, we will get the final report with more detailed information, and where you will see what we just presented here, plus some other details. And thank you for joining. Thank you for being with us. Now it's time for a Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to send it. Alex and I will be happy to answer them during the session or after it if there is not enough time. Let's say let's see what questions we get. Okay. So we have one question here. So, okay, see, yes. You have shared a great overview of what happened in the past. Any insights of what we should expect moving forward, Alex?
Yes, I can take this one. What we should expect moving forward, right? Is that the question, Felipe?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's a great question, and thank you for whoever asked it. I think to understand what to expect, we need to consider what happened. It is a fact the pandemic period between 2020 and 21 had a significant impact on the economy and the industry, also impacting consumer behaviors. On the macroeconomic scale, manufacturers had to deal with supply chain disruption, with chip shortages, you said that, Felipe, and factories also have been temporarily shut down. Manufacturers also had to deal with a lower demand and a new car market decline. Car sales are slowly recovering, but in this post-pandemic phase, demand is still on the lower end, I would say, and the industry will continue to be impacted by shortages and also by regulations. In fact, many countries have already announced or taken a step further by putting the phase out of internal combustion engines into a law. Last year, I think it was in July 2021, the European Commission announced a new package of climate legislation to get the EU to a target of a 55% reduction in emissions by 2030, and then a ban on internal combustion engines from 2035. To make it clear for the audience, the Commission is not actually banning anything, but rather requiring that all new vehicles sold from that date, 2035, be zero emissions. With existing technology constraints and costs, this means de facto no more ICE vehicles just 13 years from now. Of course, innovation in alternative fuels could potentially allow existing ICE vehicles to be powered by fully renewable fuels in the future. But for now, electric vehicles, as we've seen, they seem to be the only mainstream option to produce no emissions on the road. If we go down to country and local level, subsidies and taxes from governments were there, and they will continue to support EVs. We've also, and I have to mention that, diesel being gradually banned in some cities across Europe. That is really important to consider. Now, in terms of consumer behavior, we've seen during the pandemic less shared mobility and public transportation. Everybody was more or less afraid to go on the bus or on the train. So we have seen also an increased usage of personal car, but with much less travel distance due to lockdowns and remote working and so on. Today, we've talked a lot about EVs, but we should be talking about electrification in general, as we've seen a boom, and this was seen in the presentation, a boom of mild hybrids and plug-in hybrids. Now, with fuel prices at record levels, we are around £2, €2 per litre in half the European countries as we speak. Consumers may think twice before purchasing or leasing a combustion vehicle. So looking forward, we expect more multimodal mobility from consumers, and with electric mobility being promoted or enforced in cities, the change we have been talking about, willingly or not, is happening. I would like to say stay tuned, because here at Jato we are preparing new events where we will speak about EVs, and we will speculate also about their future in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Alex. We also have one more questions. One is related to what we just presented. Which is the European country that is selling more EVs? You have shared that Finland was second and Norway the third. Actually, this is not the country selling more EVs. It's the country that posted the highest EVs market share increase between the 2 years. So it was not Norway, it wasn't Finland, it was Denmark. Denmark the EVs posted the highest market share gain between these 2 years. Then we also have another question. Are there, probably this is, you can answer this, Alex, because I know that France is already taxed, or they're planning to tax SUVs, but are there other countries which are thinking about taxation SUVs? Before you answer, I must say something. I think this is not about SUVs, this is not about segments, this is about emissions. So if the car has whatever it is, has a lot of emissions, the current regulation is supposed to tax these cars more than, I mean, these vehicles more than the other ones. So it can be a sedan, it can be an SUV, or it can be a hatchback, but it's in terms of emissions. What's the situation in France, Alex?
It's true that in France there is no tax on SUVs per se, but we have since this year, since 2022, there is a new tax based on the vehicle weight. So from 1.8 tons and above, so 1,800 kilos, there is a tax of 10 euros per kilo above this threshold. So it's not for SUVs. It's depending on the vehicle weight, and obviously SUVs are heavier, but you know, it's just a body type, it's a body factor in some way. So you could have any type of vehicle that is above this threshold to get this weight tax. Practically speaking, this is impacting a very, very little fraction of the vehicles sold every year. We are talking about a couple of % of market share, which is something, but is overall it's almost negligible. So even for brands that are heavily selling SUVs, it is just impacting a fraction of their vehicles. So if you pick, for instance, the German brands, you have only a tax from a Mercedes GLE or BMW X5 and above, and this tax based on the vehicle price is in some way could be acceptable compared to the CO2 taxes that are actually heavier, and in total it could go up to 40,000 euros of CO2 tax in France. So you can get an extra 40,000 euros to pay to purchase a vehicle. Countries are acting differently on this aspect. Some countries are not taxing at all, or not providing any SUVs subsidies, sorry. And some countries are heavily investing. Italy just announced a new plan with billions of investment to subsidize even more electric vehicles, for instance, and they are actually copying in some way what is going on in France, because the subsidy will be around 6,000 euros for electric vehicles. We expect to see that much more in the future. So a reduction on subsidies for anything that is hybrid, an increase of taxes on CO2, and not necessarily on SUVs, so CO2 and weight probably, and a continuous support on EVs, even if the subsidy might be reduced as we move forward. So as we transition, the total amount that is being subsidized by governments is expected to go down with this transition happening.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. One final one, I'm taking it. Do you expect the impact of global events such as Ukraine to further delay delivery of vehicles and put additional price pressure on EVs, plug-in hybrids? Yes, it's already happening. This is one more challenge for the industry. Some car makers in Germany, for example, had to stop producing cars with the impact on prices and the availability of cars. So if the industry was already struggling with the semiconductor issues, now the Ukraine crisis, it's making it worse. And we hope this can be solved soon and the industry can finally find a better situation. However, in 2021, under this very difficult situation, not Ukraine, but semiconductor issues and the pandemic, the OEMs were able to, many OEMs were able to increase profits at the expense of lower sales. So they sold fewer cars, but they earn more money. And this is because they are focusing on on the most profitable segments. If there is not enough semiconductors up there, they are using the very few they have to produce SUVs or electric vehicles. And in both cases, they are making more money, even if the prices are higher. So, I mean, which means that the demand is lower. But they are learning from the crisis, and they are even making more money from it. So I think we should continue seeing the price pressure in the coming months. I think that's it for now. We are on time. Thank you for all your questions. We will try to answer all of them. We got many here, but we will answer them in the coming days. And tomorrow you will get the final report. Thank you, Alex, for joining.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you all for attending.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day.